Genesis 15, the covenant. After these things, the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. And Abram said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless? And thy steward of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, no born in my house is mine heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, This shall not be thine heir, but he thy shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. And he brought him forth abroad, and looked now toward heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. And he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit. And he said, Lord God, where shall I know that I shall inherit it? Whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? And he said unto him, Take me an heifer of 3 years old, and a she goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he took unto him all these, and divided them into the mists, and laid each piece one against the other, but the birds divided he not. And when the fowls came down upon the carcasses, Abram drove them away. And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, an honor of great darkness fell upon him. And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in the land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve I will judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. And thou shalt go thy father in peace, and thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it went dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passes between those pieces. In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, Unto thy seed I have given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenites and the Kenizzites and the Kadamites and the Hittites and the Pezerites and the Rephaims and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Girgashites and the Jezebites. Whoa. Following the cinematic high of crushing 4 armies in chapter 14, Genesis 15 drops us deep into a deeply psychological, raw, and terrifying encounter between Abram and God. This chapter is structural anchor of Abraham's life. It is where the vague promise of the previous chapters are legally locked into a formal binding blood covenant. Here's the context behind these intense dramas. The chapter opens with God telling Abraham in a vision, Fear not, Abraham, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. Why would God start by saying, fear not? Think about Abraham's real world situation. He just executed a nighttime guerrilla raid against a massive coalition of Mesopotamian kings to rescue Lot. The adrenaline has worn off. Abram is likely terrified of a retaliatory invasion. He's a lonely nomad living in tents, and he has just made some incredibly powerful international enemies. Instead of thanking God for his shield, Abraham snaps back with brutal honesty. He essentially says, what good are the rewards of shields if I don't have a son to inherit them? Under ancient Near Eastern law, if a man died without heir, his entire estate and wealth would be automatically passed to his chief household servant. In this case, a man named Eliezer of Damascus. Abraham is growing old, his wife Sarai is barren, and he feels like God's promise of a great nation are slipping through his fingers. God responds by taking Abraham outside into the dark Mesopotamian night sky and issuing a breathtaking visual challenge. Look not towards the heaven and count the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, so shall thy seed be. Then comes verse 6, one of the most famous theological milestones in the entire Bible. And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. Abraham had zero physical proof, but he chose to trust God's character over his own biological limitations. To prove he's serious, God tells Abraham to gather a collection of animals: a heifer, a goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a pigeon. To a modern reader, what happens next sounds like a horror movie. Abraham kills the animals, cuts them directly down the middle, and lays the split halves opposite each other, creating a bloody pathway on the ground. This was a standard legal ritual in the ancient Near East for signing an absolute high stakes treaty. It was called cutting a covenant. Karat Berit. That's crazy, dude. The traditional ritual, two parties walking side by side down a bloody pathway between the split pieces. They are acting out a graphic oath. If I break this contract, may I be ripped apart and slaughtered just like these animals. As the sun goes down, a horror of great darkness falls upon Abram, and he falls into a deep, paralyzed sleep. While he is frozen, God gives him a prophetic preview of history. He tells him that his descendants will be enslaved in a foreign land, Egypt, for 400 years, but that God will judge that nation and bring them out with great wealth to inherit this exact land. So they're supposed to inherit Egypt? As the sun goes down, a horror of great darkness falls over Abraham. He falls into a deep, paralyzed sleep. While frozen, God gives him a prophetic preview of history. He tells him that his descendants will be enslaved in a foreign land, Egypt, for 400 years, but that God will judge that nation and bring them out with great wealth to inherit this exact land. He tells him that his descendants will be enslaved by a foreign land for 400 years, talking about Egypt, but that God will judge that nation and bring them out with great wealth to inherit this exact land. Then comes a stunning climax of chapter verse 17. And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark Behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp, flaming torch that passes between those pieces. A flaming torch passes through the pieces of the bodies that were split in half. Fire and smoke and the standard biblical symbols for the terrifying radiant presence of God, the same way God appears later as a pillar of cloud and fire at Mount Sinai. Fire and smoke are the standard biblical symbols for terrifying radiant presence of God. But notice the radical twist. Abraham does not walk down the path, only the flaming presence of God passes between the severed animals. By walking through the pieces alone while Abraham is asleep, God is signing a unilateral, unconditional contract. He is saying, I am binding myself to this promise, even if your descendants mess up and break their side of the agreement, I will take the penalty of death upon myself to ensure this promise is fulfilled. God is saying, I am binding myself to this promise, even if your descendants mess up and break their side of the arrangement. I will take the penalty of death upon myself to ensure this promise is fulfilled.